in the Bronze Age cradle, where empires carved their names in stone and blood, where Babylon's hanging gardens defied heaven and ziggurats pierced clouds like spears thrust at eternity, the most audacious experiment in human history was quietly unfolding. Here, among peoples who worshipped gods of gold and offered children to furnaces, a single voice would call forth a revolution that would outlast every throne, every temple, every civilization that seemed permanent as the mountains themselves. From Mesopotamia's temple-crowned cities to Canaan's contested hills, through Egyptian bondage and wilderness wandering, across conquests and captivities, one thread weaves through the tapestry of millennia, the rise and fall of ancient Israel. This is the story of shepherds who became kings, of slaves who shattered empires, of a people who lost everything, yet preserved what no sword could destroy. In palaces and caves, through triumph and exile, their covenant with the unseen would reshape not just their own destiny, but the spiritual architecture of the world. Beyond the great rivers of Mesopotamia, where ziggurats pierce the sky like fingers reaching toward heaven, a Bronze Age world sprawls beneath the burning sun. Across the Fertile Crescent, city-states rise and fall. Babylon, with her hanging gardens, Ur of the Chaldees, where merchants count silver and priests read omens in bird flight. In this tapestry of nations, Canaan sits like a jewel between empires, her coastal plains green with grain, her hills purple with vineyards. Here, Amorite kings rule from fortified cities, while Egyptian caravans wind through mountain passes. Among these ancient peoples, where gods dwell in temples of hewn stone, one voice will call forth a revolution that reshapes the spiritual landscape of mankind. From Ur's temple-crowned ziggurat, a voice like thunder speaks to one man's heart, commanding him to leave his country, his people, and his father's household for a land yet unseen. Abraham, still called Abram in those days, hears words that cut through the noise of commerce and ceremony, like a bronze blade through silk. When Abram gathers his household and turns his face toward the setting sun, he carries more than silver and livestock. He bears the seed of a sacred oath that will grow into a tree whose branches shelter nations. Westward flows this caravan of destiny, past the great bend of the Euphrates, where Haran's merchants count profit. Here death claims terror, and here the heavenly compact takes fuller shape. The Almighty promises to make him into a great nation, to bless him and make his name great, declaring that all peoples on earth will be blessed through him. Three elements forge this pact's golden chain: land flowing with milk and honey, offspring numerous as stars in heaven's vault, and divine favor that pours through this chosen lineage to touch every tribe beneath the sun's circuit. Into Canaan's borders comes the Patriarch like dawn, breaking over hills that have slumbered through ages of struggle. At Shechem, heaven's word takes flesh as the Almighty declares his intention to give this territory to Abram's offspring. An altar rises beneath ancient oaks, marking faith's first footprint upon soil that will drink martyrs' blood. Southward, through the hill, country winds Abraham's path, past Jerusalem where Melchizedek rules as priest-king of the Most High God. This mysterious figure emerges from the city's gates bearing bread and wine, blessing the patriarch as one favored by the Creator of heaven and earth. When Abraham offers a tenth of everything to this priest of Salem, he establishes patterns enduring long after his bones rest in Machpelah's cave. Years flow like water through an hourglass, while the patriarch's household wanders between southern borders and Damascus's walls. Sarah remains barren despite celestial pledges that her womb will birth nations. But when heavenly messengers appear beneath Mamre's oaks, announcing aged Sarah will bear the child of destiny. Heaven's laughter mingles with earth's amazement. Isaac, whose name means laughter, enters the world carrying in his identity the joy of impossible vows fulfilled. Upon Moriah's heights, where Jerusalem's temple will one day crown the mount with cedar and gold, Abraham faces faith's ultimate test. The divine command cuts deeper than bronze, demanding he sacrifice his beloved son as a burnt offering. On Moriah's summit, heavenly intervention stays the patriarch's hand when steel hovers above Isaac's throat. A ram, caught by horns in a thicket's embrace, dies in the boy's place while the divine voice proclaims renewed oaths. Isaac grows to manhood, bearing miraculous birth's mark. At Beersheba's wells, he takes Rebekah as wife, beautiful daughter brought from Mesopotamia's distant plains. Twin sons struggle in Rebekah's womb before birth, presaging conflicts shaping nations yet unborn. Esau emerges first, red and hairy, followed by Jacob grasping his twin's heel as if already reaching for blessings not his own. At Beersheba, where desert winds whisper secrets old as time, Jacob receives his grandfather's inheritance through visions transforming a stone pillow into a gateway between earth and heaven. Angels ascend and descend the celestial ladder, while the divine voice proclaims the sacred pact anew. 20 years in Mesopotamia's service teach Jacob lessons no father's instruction could impart. 11 sons and 1 daughter spring from his loins during exile years, children whose descendants will become tribes bearing their names. By Jabbok's ford, Jacob meets his match in supernatural combat, transforming him from supplanter to prince. All night, he wrestles with a figure whose nature remains shrouded in mystery. When dawn touches eastern hills, the wrestler grants a new name. No longer Jacob, but one who has struggled with God and overcome. Among Jacob's 12 sons, Joseph shines with favor, kindling his siblings' jealousy into murderous flame. Dreams of sheaves and stars bowing before his glory strike their hearts like poisoned arrows. When opportunity presents itself in Dothan's fields, they sell him to Ishmaelite traders, bound for Egypt's markets. Down into slavery sinks this son of destiny, his coat of many colors torn and bloodied to deceive their father. Yet heaven's providence works through human evil, like light refracting through crystal. In Potiphar's house, Joseph rises through faithful service to become overseer. When his master's wife sets seduction snares across his path, the young Hebrew chooses integrity over advancement. His refusal kindles her fury into false accusation, sending him into Pharaoh's prison. Even in confinement, divine favor rests upon Joseph like morning dew. When Pharaoh's butler and baker share troubling visions, Joseph unlocks their meaning with keys heaven provides. 2 years later, when dreams haunt Egypt's ruler with visions of fat and lean cattle, no magician can interpret their significance until the butler remembers the Hebrew prisoner. Standing before Pharaoh in borrowed robes, Joseph interprets the royal dreams with authority flowing from heaven's throne room. 7 years of abundance will yield to 7 years of famine so severe that prosperity's memory will be devoured. At 30 years, Joseph rides forth from Memphis in Pharaoh's second chariot, while heralds cry before him. From the delta's green fields to Aswan's rocky cataracts, all Egypt bows before this administrator, whose wisdom preserves their nation from starvation. When famine spreads across the ancient Near East, only Egypt possesses sufficient stores. From Canaan's hills, where Jacob's flocks grow thin, 10 sons journey southward to buy bread. Only Benjamin remains home, shielded by his father's love from dangers that devoured Rachel's firstborn. After testing their hearts through imprisonment and accusations, after Judah offers himself as substitute for Benjamin's safety, Joseph can maintain his disguise no longer. The explosion of recognition comes like thunder as he declares his identity and asks whether his father still lives. Divine mathematics transforming human evil into providential preservation flows through his explanation. God sent him ahead to preserve life during the famine years. Pharaoh's joy at this revelation exceeds even the family's amazement. Royal provision supplies carts for the journey, while gifts flow like water from a spring. Into Canaan's hills speeds news defying belief. Joseph still lives and rules all Egypt. When the aged patriarch sees royal carts loaded with provisions, his spirit revives. At Beersheba's wells, Jacob offers sacrifices while seeking heaven's guidance. In night visions, the divine voice carries reassurance. 70 souls descend into Egypt's borders. Jacob and his sons, their wives and children, the entire household carrying sacred inheritance into foreign soil. At Goshen's borders, father and son embrace, while 22 years of separation dissolve like morning mist. When death finally claims Jacob, his burial procession rivals that of royalty. From Goshen to Hebron winds a cortege carrying the patriarch home to rest beside Abraham and Sarah in Machpelah's purchased cave. Joseph's own death at 110 years marks the end of an era when covenant inheritance dwelt securely under Pharaoh's protection. But time's passage brings change to the land of the Nile. A new king arose who did not know Joseph or remember the Hebrew administrator who saved the nation from starvation. This Pharaoh looked upon the children of Jacob, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and saw not grateful guests but potential threats. The new regime imposed harsh labor upon Abraham's descendants, forcing them to build treasure cities with bricks made from delta mud and straw. Yet the more they oppressed the Hebrew people, the more they multiplied. When forced labor failed to contain their growth, Pharaoh commanded the midwives to kill all Hebrew male children at birth. Finally, in desperation, he issued a decree: every boy born must be thrown into the Nile. Into this darkness came a child whose survival defied royal decree. When Amram of the house of Levi took Jochebed as his wife, their union produced a son so beautiful that his mother hid him 3 months, rather than surrender him to the Nile's hungry waters. When concealment became impossible, faith took the form of a waterproofed basket woven from bulrushes. Among the reeds where Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe, the infant floated like hope itself, riding upon destruction's waters. When the princess discovered the crying child, her heart moved with compassion, transcending political boundaries. Moses, meaning drawn out, grew up in Pharaoh's house with access to the finest education, while never forgetting the suffering of his people. When Moses reached manhood, righteous anger flamed in his heart until it consumed caution. His bronze blade found its mark in an overseer's flesh, and earth drank blood, while desert wind scattered sand over evidence of liberation turned to murder. Fear drove Moses from the only home he had known into wilderness, where his royal education meant nothing. At a well in Midian, Moses found purpose in protection and meaning in service. His intervention earned gratitude, blossoming into marriage with Zipporah. For 40 years he tended sheep in wilderness places where silence taught lessons palace education could never impart. On Horeb's slopes, divine fire blazed in a thorn bush that burned but was not consumed. From those flames came a voice reshaping history and transforming a fugitive shepherd into the greatest deliverer the covenant people would ever know. The commission, demanding more faith than Moses possessed, met with divine assurance. When the people were brought out of bondage, they would worship God on this very mountain. Back toward the land of the Nile traveled Moses with his wife and sons, carrying a shepherd's staff. Heaven had transformed into an instrument of wonder and judgment. Aaron met him at God's mountain, and together the siblings approached their enslaved kinsman with news too good to believe. The Almighty had heard their groaning and remembered his sacred bonds with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Before Pharaoh's throne, Moses delivered heaven's ultimatum. The message came clear and uncompromising. The God of the Hebrews demanded his people's release for wilderness worship. But the king's response revealed Egyptian pride's depth and human rebellion's breadth against celestial authority. What followed challenged every assumption about heavenly power and human pride. As 10 plagues fell upon Egypt like hammer blows upon an anvil refusing to bend. Water turned to blood, frogs swarmed, gnats rose from dust, flies invaded while Goshen remained untouched. Livestock died, boils erupted, hail fell like stones while fire ran along the ground. Locusts devoured what hail had spared. Then darkness thick enough to feel descended for 3 days while the Hebrews dwelt in light. But the 10th plague would be different, striking not at comfort, but at human love's very heart. Moses announced that about midnight, death would claim every firstborn, from Pharaoh's heir to the slave girl's child. On the 14th day of the first month, the Hebrews prepared for deliverance through lamb's blood. Each household selected an unblemished male, 1 year old. At twilight, family heads took the blood and put it on doorframes' sides and tops, then roasted the meat over fire and ate it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. The blood would be a sign, and when the destroyer saw the blood, he would pass over them. At midnight, when the destroying angel moved through Egypt like judgment given wings, death entered every house where blood did not mark the doorframe. From Pharaoh's palace to dungeon's depths, the firstborn breathed their last while families' cries rose like grief's incense. In all the land, not a house existed where someone had not died, except in Goshen, where lamb's blood purchased life. The king, who had defied heaven's repeated warnings, now summoned Moses and Aaron in that terrible night's darkness. He commanded them to leave immediately with all their people, to take their flocks and herds as requested, and to worship their God. From Ramesses marched 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, carrying dough with no time to rise, and treasures pressed upon them by neighbors desperate to see them gone. Eastward toward wilderness they traveled, guided by a pillar of cloud shielding them from desert sun by day, and becoming fire to light their way by night. At Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, the covenant people found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's approaching army and waters too deep to ford. But Moses lifted his staff over waters that had never known division, and heaven displayed power reducing human engineering to child's play. All night, the east wind blew, while divine intervention pushed back the sea until it stood like walls on either side of a pathway paved with ocean floor. When morning light revealed the sea's division to Egyptian eyes, chariot wheels found sand where water should have been. Into the same corridor that had become the Hebrews' highway to freedom, Pharaoh's army drove with predators' confidence. But when the staff was raised, the walls of water came crashing down with the roar of thunder, burying chariots and horses alike. Not one survived to carry defeat's news back to the royal court. On the far shore, as Egyptian bodies rolled in like driftwood after a storm, the people of the covenant raised their first song of freedom. Tambourines rang in Miriam's hands as the women danced, and a triumphant voice rose beside them. Into Shur's wilderness they marched, carrying Joseph's bones as their most precious treasure, while fire and cloud from heaven guided their steps toward an appointment with God's mountain. Behind them lay 4 centuries of slavery, ended in a single night of judgment from above. Ahead stretched 40 years of desert wandering that would forge a nation from slaves and write heaven's law upon stone tablets. From Sinai's smoking peak, where thunder spoke the law and lightning carved commandments into stone, the covenant people carried divine fire in their hearts across wilderness wastes toward the land of ancient pledge. When Joshua led them across Jordan's divided waters, and Jericho's walls fell to trumpet blast and shouted prayer, the conquest blazed across Canaan like wildfire consuming dry stubble. Yet the conquest remained incomplete, like a tapestry half woven upon heaven's loom. Pockets of resistance remained scattered across hill country and coastal plains, Canaanite strongholds where bronze chariots gleamed, Philistine cities where iron weapons sang their songs of technological supremacy. Jebusite Jerusalem perched upon its rocky throne like an eagle's nest beyond reach. Among the tribes, no central authority held sway once Joshua's bones rested beside those of Joseph in Shechem's hallowed ground. Each clan settled into its allotted inheritance, while the ark of the sacred compact dwelt at Shiloh, tended by Levite priests whose voices lifted daily sacrifices toward heaven's throne. In those days, no king ruled over the children of Abraham. Each man did what seemed right in his own eyes. Into this loose confederation came testing, like waves against a crumbling seawall. The peoples whom Joshua had not utterly destroyed pressed back against Hebrew settlements with increasing boldness, while new enemies arose beyond Jordan's eastern banks and the Great Sea's western shores. When oppression grew too heavy to bear, the tribes would cry out to the God of their fathers, and he would raise up deliverers, judges who combined military command, civil magistrate, and prophetic voice. Othniel of Judah first answered heaven's call when Mesopotamian raiders swept down from the north, like locusts devouring harvest. His bronze sword carved freedom from foreign yoke, while his voice proclaimed divine justice to assembled multitudes. 8 years of peace followed his victory before new threats arose to test the covenant people's faithfulness. When the tribes again forgot their divine benefactor and turned to wooden gods and stone altars, Eglon, king of Moab, crossed Jordan with Ammonite allies to exact tribute from those who had forgotten the source of their strength. For 18 years, his tax collectors stripped Hebrew granaries, while his soldiers reminded the conquered that iron spears speak louder than ancient pledges. But Ehud, the left-handed son of Gera from Benjamin's fierce tribe, carried more than tribute when he approached Eglon's throne. Concealed beneath his robes, a cubit-long blade waited for the moment when private audience would become divine judgment. In the cooling chamber where the Moabite king received his Hebrew vassal, bronze found flesh with surgical precision. The deed accomplished, the judge escaped, while confusion reigned among guards discovering their master's corpse. The horn of liberation sounded across Ephraim's hills as Ehud rallied the tribes to seize Jordan's fords before Moabite reinforcements could cross. That day, 10,000 enemy warriors fell beneath Hebrew bronze, while none escaped to carry news of defeat back to their homeland. 80 years of peace followed Ehud's deliverance, but memory never lasts as long as flesh, and the pattern returns with wearying inevitability. New apostasy brought new oppression as Jabin, king of Hazor, sent his general Sisera with 900 iron chariots to remind the covenant people that military technology often determines political reality. For 20 years, those wheeled fortresses thundered across Canaanite plains, while Hebrew foot soldiers learned to fear the sound of bronze-rimmed wheels. In those dark days, when Canaanite overlords collected tribute from trembling villages, leadership arose from an unexpected source. Deborah the prophetess held court beneath a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel, dispensing justice with wisdom that flowed from divine springs. While her words carried authority even tribal elders recognized. When the Spirit of the Almighty stirred within her heart, she summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh, with words that blazed like fire from heaven's altar. The time had come to break Canaanite power, to draw Sisera and his iron chariots to Mount Tabor, where terrain would favor Hebrew tactics over foreign technology. 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun would follow Barak to victory. But Barak's response revealed the fear that iron weapons had planted in Hebrew hearts. He would go if Deborah accompanied him, but not otherwise. The prophetess agreed, though her words carried prophetic irony. The victory would bring no glory to Barak's name, for the Almighty would deliver Sisera into a woman's hand. From Mount Tabor's heights, Hebrew forces descended like an avalanche, while heaven opened its floodgates to turn Kishon's valley into a quagmire that swallowed Canaanite chariots. Where iron wheels had thundered in dominance, now they spun helplessly in mud, while Hebrew spears found their marks. Sisera himself abandoned his chariot to flee on foot toward the tents of Heber the Kenite. But fate wore a woman's face that day, as Deborah had prophesied. Jael, wife of Heber, received the fleeing general with hospitality that masked deadly purpose. While he slept beneath her tent's protective cover, her hammer drove a tent peg through his temple into the earth beneath. The song that followed, Deborah's victory hymn, rang across the hills like bronze bells celebrating divine deliverance. 40 years of peace followed that great victory, and still the cycle rolled on, as relentless as the tides and as ruinous as a plague. New apostasy brought new enemies, as the Midianites swept across Jordan like a tide of destruction, their camel cavalry carrying devastation into Hebrew heartland with speed no foot soldier could match. For 7 years, these desert raiders appeared at harvest time to strip the land bare. Among those who ground wheat in secret places, Gideon, son of Joash, threshed grain in a winepress to hide his work from Midianite patrols. Here the angel of the Almighty found him, addressing this frightened farmer as a mighty warrior, while commissioning him to save his people from their oppressors. The answer came not in words, but in signs that blazed with supernatural fire. That night, divine command directed the reluctant judge to tear down his father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. When the townspeople discovered their shrine destroyed and demanded Gideon's death, his father displayed wisdom beyond human understanding, suggesting that Baal should defend himself if he truly possessed divine power. When Midianite hordes crossed Jordan like locusts settling upon a harvest field, the Spirit of the Almighty clothed itself in Gideon's flesh, while his trumpet call echoed across tribal territories. 32,000 men answered his summons, but divine strategy required smaller numbers to ensure victory's credit would flow toward heaven rather than human prowess. At the water's edge, final selection occurred through the simple test of drinking technique. Those who lapped water like dogs, maintaining vigilance while quenching thirst, numbered only 300, but these formed the core of heaven's chosen instrument. With nothing but trumpets, torches, and empty jars, this tiny force would accomplish what conventional armies could not achieve. During the middle watch, while sleep hung thick over the enemy camp, 3 companies closed in around the Midianite host. At Gideon's signal, trumpet blasts shattered the night silence, while torches blazed from broken jars and Hebrew voices proclaimed victory. Confusion spread through enemy ranks as frightened warriors struck down their own comrades in darkness, while those who recognized the disaster fled eastward. In victory's aftermath, grateful tribes offered Gideon royal authority, but the judge's response revealed understanding that would be forgotten by future generations. He would not rule over them, nor would his sons, for the Almighty alone possessed sovereignty over the covenant people. After Gideon's death, his son Abimelech demonstrated the dangers that royal ambition posed to tribal confederation. Using silver stolen from Baal's temple, he hired worthless mercenaries to murder 70 of his kinsmen, clearing his path to kingship through fraternal blood. 3 years of tyranny proved the wisdom of avoiding monarchy, ending when a woman's millstone crushed the would-be king's skull at Thebez. From Gilead arose Jephthah, son of a prostitute whose kinsman had driven him away to prevent inheritance claims. When Ammonite pressure grew unbearable, these same elders who had expelled him came seeking his military expertise. Before resorting to warfare, Jephthah attempted diplomacy, sending messengers with historical arguments demonstrating Hebrew rights to disputed territories. When diplomacy failed, Jephthah prepared for battle with a vow that would haunt his victory with tragedy. If the Almighty delivered the Ammonites into his hands, he would offer as burnt sacrifice whatever came out of his house to meet him upon return. But heaven's irony cuts deeper than human expectations. His only daughter came dancing out to meet him with tambourines in celebration. The vow had been spoken before the Almighty and could not be broken. 2 months in the mountains gave the maiden time to bewail her virginity before returning to fulfill her father's desperate pledge. Her sacrifice became a memorial among Hebrew daughters, transforming military victory into Pyrrhic triumph. Into Philistine crisis came Samson, last and most flawed of the great judges, whose supernatural strength flowed from divine blessing and Nazirite vows. From birth, his destiny was proclaimed by angelic messengers. No razor would touch his head, no wine would pass his lips, and through his consecration, he would begin to deliver the covenant people from Philistine domination. Samson's story feels like a long list of what might have been. His marriage to a Philistine woman from Timnah brought conflict rather than alliance, while his riddle about honey from a lion's carcass led to betrayal and revenge. 300 foxes became instruments of agricultural warfare when he tied their tails together with torches and released them into enemy grain fields. When 3,000 men of Judah came to arrest him for endangering tribal security, Samson submitted to binding rather than resist his own kinsmen. But at Lehi, where Philistine soldiers gathered to claim their prize, a surge of heaven-sent strength snapped his bonds like flax scorched by fire. A fresh donkey's jawbone became his weapon as he struck down 1,000 enemies in single combat. 20 years Samson judged in the days of Philistine pressure, yet his leadership remained episodic rather than systematic. His weakness for foreign women led him repeatedly into compromising situations where personal pleasure conflicted with public duty. Finally, Delilah of Sorek became the instrument of his downfall through persistent inquiry into the source of his supernatural strength. When persistent questioning wore down heroic resolve, Samson finally revealed the truth. His strength lay in his uncut hair, symbol of his Nazirite consecration. While he slept upon her knees, Delilah called for a barber to shave away 7 locks. Philistine soldiers bound him with bronze chains before gouging out his eyes and setting him to grinding grain like a beast of burden. Even so, godly mercy extends beyond human failure. When his hair began to grow again during months of captivity, so did his supernatural strength return. At the great festival, where 3,000 Philistines gathered to mock their captive enemy, the judge made his final prayer. Positioned between the temple's supporting pillars, Samson called upon the Almighty for strength one last time. When strength from above surged back into his arms, the temple crumbled in thunderous ruin, burying more Philistines than he had slain in all his life. With Samson's death, the age of judges drew toward its close, while new challenges arose that tribal confederation could not adequately address. At Shiloh, where the Ark of the Sacred Compact rested within its tent sanctuary, corruption spread through the priestly house like gangrene through wounded flesh. Eli the high priest, whose eyes had grown dim with age, could not control his sons Hophni and Phinehas as they perverted temple worship into personal profit. These corrupt priests showed no respect for the sacred offerings, seizing meat from the sacrifice before the rightful portions had burned on the altar, while their servants bullied worshippers with threats. Worse still, they lay with women who served at the sanctuary entrance, polluting holy ground with sexual immorality. Into this corrupt environment came Samuel, born to Hannah's barren womb through answered prayer and dedicated to temple service from his earliest years. While still a child, he heard a voice from beyond calling his name in the night watches, learning to recognize the language of heaven, while older men remained deaf to the call. The word of Samuel proved reliable throughout the land, as the Almighty established him as a prophet, letting none of his words fall to the ground unfulfilled. From Dan to Beersheba, all the covenant people knew that Samuel had been established as the voice of heaven for their time. But crisis came when Philistine armies gathered at Aphek, while Hebrew forces assembled at Ebenezer. The first day's battle went badly, with 4,000 falling before Philistine iron. Desperate for celestial intervention, tribal elders decided to bring the ark from Shiloh, believing its presence would guarantee victory. When the ark arrived, accompanied by Hophni and Phinehas, the Hebrew war cry shook the earth, while Philistine hearts grew cold with fear. Yet courage born of desperation drove their resistance, as commanders rallied troops with reminders that defeat would reduce them to Hebrew slavery. The battle that followed crushed Hebrew confidence, revealing that ritual objects hold no power of their own without the favor of heaven. 30,000 foot soldiers fell, and the ark was carried off as a trophy by their enemies. Among the dead were Eli's 2 sons, whose corrupt lives ended where they tried to twist sacred things for military gain. But the Philistines soon learned that capturing the ark brought more curse than blessing. In Dagon's temple at Ashdod, their god's statue fell prostrate before the Hebrew ark, then shattered when restored. Tumors broke out among the population, while mice overran their territory. From city to city, the ark passed, Ashdod to Gath to Ekron, carrying devastation wherever Philistine hands profaned its sacred presence. 7 months of misery taught the sea peoples that some victories come with a price heavier than loss. At last, the ark left Philistine lands on a new cart, pulled by 2 milk cows parted from their calves, a test to see whether recent plagues were the work of heaven or simple coincidence. The cattle took the road toward Beth Shemesh without deviation, confirming supernatural intervention. Samuel, meanwhile, established a new form of leadership, traveling on circuit between Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah to judge disputes and maintain justice. Yet even his wise leadership could not solve fundamental problems plaguing tribal confederation. His sons Joel and Abijah, appointed as judges in Beersheba, proved corrupt like Eli's offspring, taking bribes and perverting justice. Philistine power remained unbroken despite the ark's return, their iron weapons still superior to Hebrew bronze. Beyond Jordan, Ammonite pressure continued, while other enemies probed for weaknesses. Most ominously, the aged prophet showed signs of mortality, while his sons demonstrated unfitness for succession. In this crisis, tribal elders gathered at Ramah to present Samuel with a request that would transform Hebrew society forever. They had observed his advancing years and his son's corruption, but their solution reached beyond immediate concerns to address deeper structural problems. The time had come for the covenant people to have a king like all the nations. Samuel's initial reaction mixed personal hurt with theological insight. The elder's request seemed to reject his lifetime of faithful service, while demanding changes that contradicted sacred intention. When he brought their petition to the Almighty in prayer, the response cut to the heart of the matter. The people had not turned against Samuel, but against the true king who had rescued them from slavery in Egypt. From the Exodus onward, they had forsaken their true sovereign to serve other gods, and now they wanted an earthly monarch to replace heavenly rule. Yet the request would be granted, though not without warning about monarchy's inevitable costs. Samuel's speech to the assembled elders painted a dark picture of royal authority's demands upon free peoples. Kings would take sons for military service and daughters for domestic labor, while confiscating fields and vineyards to reward court favorites. Heavy taxation would support royal bureaucracy, while forced labor would build palaces. The day would come when they would cry out because of their king, but heaven would not answer their complaints about burdens they had chosen. But the elders remained unmoved by prophetic warnings, their minds fixed upon practical necessities that seemed to require royal solutions. They wanted a king to judge them and fight their battles, to provide unified leadership that could match their enemies' military organization. Their final argument carried weight that theological objections could not overcome. They desired to be like all the nations surrounding them. Approval from on high came with a heavy heart, as Samuel was granted leave to fulfill their demand, yet urged to warn them once more of what a king would bring. Unseen among the tribes, the one marked for the crown was already moving toward a destiny that would alter Israel forever. The age of judges did not fall to enemies, but to a choice from within, to surrender the rule of the unseen for the crown of the seen. In becoming like every other nation, they gained power and polish, but lost the sacred identity that had made them a treasure among the peoples of the earth. Among the hills of Benjamin, where olive groves cast silver shadows and ancient paths wound between terraced fields, the prophet Samuel carried sacred oil in his horn, while divine sorrow weighed heavy upon his heart. The Almighty had rejected Saul for disobedience that revealed the true character beneath royal purple. Now heaven's choice must fall upon another, one whose heart beat in rhythm with celestial purposes rather than human pride. From Ramah's heights, the aged seer journeyed toward Bethlehem at heavenly command. His mission required secrecy, for Saul's jealous nature would interpret any anointing as treason against the crown. Under cover of offering sacrifice, Samuel would pour oil upon the head of Jesse's youngest son, a shepherd boy whose destiny would reshape kingdoms. In Bethlehem's gate, the elders trembled at Samuel's approach, for the prophet's visits often brought judgment upon hidden sins, but his words carried peace as he invited them to consecrate themselves for sacred worship. Jesse the Bethlehemite came with his household, 8 sons standing in birth order, while their father presented each one for prophetic inspection. Eliab the eldest stood tall and strong, his warrior's frame suggesting royal potential that caught Samuel's eye like sunlight on polished bronze. Surely this firstborn bore the marks of heavenly selection. But the Almighty's voice whispered correction. Man looks upon outward appearance, but the Creator sees the heart's hidden chambers where true character dwells. One by one, 7 sons passed before the seer, while celestial silence met each presentation. All bore Jesse's blood and masculine strength, yet none stirred prophetic recognition that heaven's choice had appeared. When the parade ended without confirmation, Samuel's confusion found voice in urgent questioning. Did Jesse have other sons beyond these 7? The father's response revealed oversight born of practical necessity. The youngest tended sheep in distant pastures, his absence seeming natural for one whose duties lay with flocks rather than formal ceremonies. But sacred purposes often hide in humble circumstances that human wisdom overlooks. When David arrived from the wilderness, dust on his cloak and the scent of mountain herbs clinging to his hair, something stirred in Samuel's prophetic consciousness, like wind touching harp strings. This ruddy youth with beautiful eyes and handsome features carried himself with quiet confidence that spoke of hours spent alone with God and danger. Without ceremony, Samuel lifted his horn of oil and poured its contents upon David's head, while his family watched in amazement. The sacred liquid ran down the shepherd's face like rain upon thirsty ground, marking him as heaven's chosen before witnesses who could not yet understand the significance. From that day forward, the Spirit of the Almighty came mightily upon David, while departing from Saul, like breath leaving a dying man. The rejected monarch found himself tormented by an evil spirit that brought depression and rage, fear and paranoia that no royal physician could heal. In desperation, his servants suggested music's healing power, searching for a skillful harper whose melodies might soothe their master's troubled mind. When courtiers recommended David's son of Jesse as both accomplished musician and valiant warrior, they unknowingly arranged the meeting between anointed successor and reigning sovereign that would set destiny's wheels in motion. In Saul's court at Gibeah, David's harp strings sang away the evil spirit's torment, while his presence brought peace to chambers that had echoed with royal anguish. Yet David's true introduction to national prominence came not through court service, but upon a battlefield where Philistine challenge met covenant faith. In the valley of Elah, where 2 armies faced each other across a narrow ravine, Goliath of Gath strode forth each morning and evening for 40 days, his bronze armor gleaming like captured sunlight, while his voice thundered defiance. 9 feet and 9 inches, Goliath stood, his coat of mail weighing 5,000 shekels of bronze, while his spear's iron point alone weighed 600 shekels. The giant's challenge cut deeper than mere military tactics, striking at the heart of covenant theology that proclaimed celestial supremacy over earthly powers. His blasphemous words demanded that the armies of the living God choose a champion to face him. Into this crisis came David, sent by his father with supplies for his brothers in Saul's army. When he heard Goliath's challenge and witnessed tribal paralysis before Philistine arrogance, righteous indignation flamed in his heart like fire catching dry tinder. The questions the youth asked among the troops revealed both practical interest and theological insight. Who was this uncircumcised dog that he should defy the armies of the living God? When Eliab heard his youngest brother's inquiries, jealous anger moved him to public rebuke. He accused David of abandoning his sheep to see the battle, of pride and wicked curiosity. But the shepherd's response deflected familial criticism, while maintaining focus on the challenge that had paralyzed resistance. Word of David's bold questioning reached Saul's ears like wind carrying news of distant thunder. When the ruler summoned this youth who seemed unimpressed by Philistine might, he found himself facing confident faith that reminded him of his own early days, when heavenly power had transformed him from donkey searcher to national deliverer. Yet Saul's initial response revealed how thoroughly fear had corrupted royal courage. David was but a youth, while Goliath had been a warrior from his boyhood. The mismatch seemed so obvious that the sovereign's responsibility demanded protecting this young volunteer from suicidal overconfidence. But David's testimony painted a different picture of celestial protection and proved prowess. When lions had threatened his father's flocks, his own hands had seized them and struck them dead. When bears had sought to carry away lambs, his strength had delivered the prey and slain the predators. The same God who had protected him from beast's claw and fang would deliver him from Philistine spear and sword. 5 smooth stones from the brook would serve as ammunition for the sling that had protected David's flocks through countless nights of danger. When Jesse's son strode across the valley toward his towering opponent, each step carried him further from human calculation and deeper into sacred mystery. Goliath's reaction to this unexpected champion mixed amusement with outrage that tribal desperation had chosen such an obviously inadequate representative. The giant's words dripped with contempt as he scorned his young opponent's youth and lack of proper weapons, threatening to give his flesh to birds and beasts as carrion. But David's response transformed physical confrontation into theological warfare, his words carrying prophetic authority that echoed across the valley like trumpet blasts. Goliath came with sword and spear and javelin, trusting in bronze and iron. But the young warrior came in the name of the Almighty, God of the armies that the Philistine had defied through 40 days of blasphemous challenge. The confrontation itself unfolded with shocking swiftness. As Goliath advanced with measured steps, David ran toward him with sling whirring through the air, like deadly music composed in heaven's armory. The stone flew true, as celestial guidance could direct it, striking the giant in the forehead with force that drove it deep into his skull. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Goliath stood swaying, while his massive frame fought against the impact that had already sealed his doom. Then he crashed to earth like a felled cedar, his armor clanging against stone, while his spirit fled to whatever afterlife awaited those who defied the living God. Without hesitation, David ran to the fallen giant and drew the massive sword from its sheath. The stroke that followed separated head from shoulders, while 2 armies watched their world reshape itself around this moment of impossible victory that demonstrated heavenly power, working through faithful courage. When Philistine forces saw their champion fallen, panic spread through their ranks like fire consuming dry grass. The withdrawal began as tactical retreat, but quickly became rout as tribal war cries echoed across the valley, and Saul's army pursued their fleeing enemies toward the gates of Ekron and Gath. That day established David's reputation throughout the kingdom, while bringing him to permanent residence in Saul's court. The monarch made him leader over men of war despite his youth. But success bred complications that innocence could not anticipate. For royal favor proves as dangerous as sovereign displeasure when jealousy corrupts the heart. The victory song that women sang as the army returned from Philistine slaughter carried lyrics that pleased the people while poisoning their ruler's heart. Their voices proclaimed that Saul had slain his thousands, while David had slain his 10,000s, comparing accomplishments in ways that revealed shifting popular loyalties. From that day forward, the troubled sovereign watched his young commander with suspicious eyes. Yet heavenly providence continued weaving patterns that human malice could not break, as Saul's own son, Jonathan, found his soul knit with David's in friendship that transcended political calculation. The heir to the throne loved his father's general as his own soul, making covenant bonds that included the exchange of robe and armor, sword and bow and belt. But Saul's deteriorating mental state transformed cautious suspicion into murderous intent as evil spirits returned to torment the troubled monarch. When David played his harp to soothe royal anguish, Saul twice hurled his spear at the musician, seeking to pin him to the wall with bronze that whistled past its target. Only celestial protection and quick reflexes preserved the anointed one from assassination disguised as accidental violence. Recognizing that direct murder might prove difficult, Saul chose more subtle methods. He promoted David to captain of 1,000, hoping that military responsibility would provide Philistine spears, with opportunity to accomplish what regal weapons had failed to achieve. But the young commander's success in every enterprise only increased his popularity while demonstrating heavenly blessing. Marriage became Saul's next weapon, as he offered his daughter Michal to David, with the understanding that a royal son-in-law would face greater military risks. The sovereign declared his willingness to give her in marriage without customary bride price, requiring only 100 Philistine foreskins as proof of military prowess. Yet David's response exceeded royal expectations, while demonstrating that celestial favor cannot be calculated by human mathematics. Within the appointed time, he returned with 200 foreskins taken from Philistine corpses, proving his worthiness for regal marriage while further establishing his reputation as a warrior whom heaven blessed with victory. The wedding that followed bound David to Saul's household through ties that should have ensured mutual loyalty, yet only increased the ruler's paranoia. Michal's love provided her husband with protection from palace intrigue, but it also gave her father new leverage for manipulation when jealousy overcame paternal affection. As David's fame spread throughout the kingdom and beyond, Saul's mental deterioration accelerated until all pretense of affection vanished in open hostility. He commanded Jonathan and all his servants to kill David, abandoning subtlety for direct action. But the prince's warning gave the intended victim opportunity to flee, while the heir attempted to reconcile his father to reason. For a moment, paternal love and reason prevailed, as Saul swore by the Almighty that David would not die. The reconciliation seemed genuine, allowing the young commander to return to court service. But the peace proved temporary, as renewed war with Philistines provided fresh opportunities for the hero's prowess to shine, further inflaming sovereign jealousy. When evil spirits again tormented Saul during one of David's musical performances, the monarch's spear found the wall once more, while its intended target escaped. That night, Michal's love provided salvation as she helped her husband escape through a window while placing an idol in their bed to deceive the soldiers her father sent to arrest him. Flight transformed David into a fugitive whose survival depended upon heavenly protection and human loyalty among those who recognized heaven's choice despite political circumstances. At Ramah, where Samuel maintained his school for prophets, the exile found temporary refuge, while the aged seer learned how completely Saul's kingdom had unraveled. When messengers came to arrest David at Ramah, the Spirit of the Almighty fell upon them, causing them to prophesy instead of capturing their quarry. The same celestial intervention affected a second and third delegation, until finally Saul himself came to finish the task. Yet the troubled ruler found himself stripped of regal dignity as sacred power overwhelmed his hostile intentions. From Ramah, David fled to Gibeah, where Jonathan met him in secret consultation that would test friendship against family loyalty. The test they devised involved the fugitive's absence from the new moon feast, where his place at the royal table would reveal the sovereign's true intentions. When David's empty seat provoked Saul to furious questioning, Jonathan's diplomatic answer about family obligations in Bethlehem ignited regal rage that removed all doubt about the monarch's intentions. Saul's words revealed not only murderous plans, but also prophetic insight. As long as David lived, Jonathan's kingdom would never be established. The signal that Jonathan gave David the following morning confirmed their worst fears while cementing their covenant bonds. Through tears of sorrow for friendship that political necessity would sever, the prince and the fugitive exchanged final vows of mutual protection that would endure beyond death itself. From that day forward, David became a fugitive leader whose court consisted of the discontented and debt-ridden, the bitter of soul who found in his leadership hope for better days. At Adullam's cave, 400 men gathered around heaven's chosen one, while Saul's pursuit continued across wilderness places. Among those who joined David's band came Abiathar the priest, sole survivor of Saul's massacre at Nob, where Ahimelech's kindness to the fugitive had cost 85 priests their lives. This atrocity marked the ruler's complete departure from heavenly favor, as he shed innocent blood in pursuit of personal vendetta. Yet even in exile, David demonstrated the character that marked him as heaven's choice for leadership. When opportunity arose to kill Saul in Engedi's caves, where the monarch had entered alone and defenseless, the fugitive restrained his men's violent counsel while cutting a corner from the royal robe as proof of his restraint. The confrontation that followed revealed both David's nobility and Saul's recognition of inevitable succession. When the exile called after the departing sovereign with words of respect and evidence of mercy, the troubled ruler's response acknowledged that his pursuer would indeed be crowned while begging protection for his family. Twice more such opportunities arose, once at Hachilah, where David penetrated Saul's camp to take the royal spear and water jug while the monarch slept, and again when circumstances provided chances for vengeance that the Anointed One refused to take. Each incident demonstrated celestial protection for both pursuer and pursued, but even David's patience had limits, and the constant pursuit wore down his faith until despair drove him to seek refuge among the Philistines themselves. At Gath, where Goliath's memory still haunted enemy councils, Achish granted sanctuary to the tribal exile, whose reputation had grown beyond territorial boundaries. For 16 months, David dwelt in Philistine territory while maintaining his band of followers and protecting his family from Saul's relentless hostility. The arrangement benefited both parties. Achish gained a valuable ally whose knowledge of tribal tactics strengthened Philistine military capability, while the fugitive found respite from constant flight. Yet heavenly purpose worked even through this apparent apostasy, as David's raids against southern tribes that threatened both covenant and Philistine interests served sacred welfare while maintaining his cover among enemies who trusted his apparent defection. When Achish prepared to join other Philistine lords in climactic battle against Saul's forces, only the suspicious objections of fellow commanders prevented the exile from facing the impossible choice. On Mount Gilboa, where Philistine victory ended Saul's tormented reign and Jonathan's noble life, the first experiment in tribal monarchy concluded in disaster that vindicated Samuel's warnings about regal government. The ruler, who had begun with such promise, died by his own sword rather than face capture, while his heir perished defending a crown he would never inherit. When news of the catastrophe reached David in Philistine territory, his response revealed the greatness that would mark his own reign. No joy at enemies' downfall, no satisfaction at vindicated patience, but genuine grief for fallen sovereign and slaughtered friend found expression in lament that transformed political triumph into personal tragedy. David's song of mourning became a masterpiece of tribal poetry that commanded the grief of a nation while preserving memory of noble deeds despite tragic endings. Saul and Jonathan, lovely and pleasant in their lives, had remained undivided in death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions, yet they had fallen upon the heights while their weapons of war perished with them. The way now lay open for heaven's chosen leader to claim his throne, yet David's ascension would prove as complex as his exile had been dangerous. From Hebron's ancient wells, where Abraham had dwelt in peace with neighboring peoples, the shepherd warrior would begin his reign over Judah, while civil war raged across the northern tribes who followed Saul's surviving son. In Hebron, where Abraham had once lived in harmony with nearby peoples, David began his kingship over Judah, while the northern tribes were caught in civil war. Ishbosheth, Saul's surviving son, claimed the throne of Israel with the backing of Abner, the former king's military commander. For 7 years, brother fought brother, while the covenant people bled in conflicts that served no divine purpose. Even so, heaven's choice could not be thwarted by human resistance. When Abner quarreled with Ishbosheth over a concubine named Rizpah, the general's wounded pride led him to negotiate secretly with David. The commander who had sustained Saul's dynasty now offered to deliver all Israel into the hands of heaven's anointed ruler. But Joab, the shepherd king's nephew and military chief, could not forgive Abner for killing his brother Asahel in earlier battle and murdered the defecting general at Hebron's gates. The assassination that should have strengthened David's position instead demonstrated his character as he mourned publicly for Abner and commanded all Israel to recognize the tragedy. When 2 of Ishbosheth's captains murdered their master in his bed and brought his head to the monarch expecting reward, the new sovereign's response revealed his commitment to justice over political convenience. Both assassins died for their treachery, while their victim received honorable burial. With opposition eliminated, the northern tribes came to David at Hebron and anointed him ruler over all Israel. 30 years old when he began to reign in Judah, he would rule the United Kingdom for 33 more years, from a capital that would become the center of the world. But first, that capital must be conquered. Jerusalem, still called Jebus, perched upon its rocky hill like an eagle's nest, defended by walls that had never fallen to siege. The Jebusites mocked the royal army, declaring that even their blind and lame could defend the city against any assault. Yet the new sovereign saw what others missed: a water shaft leading from the city to the spring of Gihon, providing access for those bold enough to climb its treacherous passage. Joab led the assault through the tunnel, his men emerging within Jerusalem's walls like phantoms materializing from stone. The city that had stood unconquered since before Abraham's time fell to the king's forces, while its inhabitants watched their impregnable fortress become the capital of a united kingdom. Strategically, the choice was genius. Jerusalem lay between Benjamin and Judah, claimed by neither side. No clan could claim ancient rights to the city that David had won through conquest, making it truly neutral ground where former enemies could serve a common sovereign. Here the shepherd warrior established his palace and brought the symbols of divine presence that would transform a Jebusite stronghold into the holy city of the covenant people. But before the ruler could bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, Philistine armies marched to crush the United Kingdom in its infancy. These sea peoples, who had dominated the coast for generations, recognized that the monarch's success threatened their expansion inland. In the valley of Rephaim, their forces assembled like locusts preparing to devour the harvest of Hebrew unity. The king inquired of the Lord whether he should attack, receiving divine assurance that the Philistines would be delivered into his hands. The battle that followed shattered enemy confidence as the sovereign led his forces to decisive victory, pursuing the fleeing Philistines from Geba to Gaza, while destroying their idols in flames that announced heaven's supremacy over foreign gods. A second Philistine assault met even more dramatic defeat when the ruler flanked their army, after hearing the sound of marching in the tops of mulberry trees, a sign that the Lord himself had gone out before them to strike down their enemies. These victories established the royal military reputation while securing Israel's borders against their most persistent enemies. With external threats eliminated, the monarch turned his attention to the sacred task that would define his reign's spiritual significance. At Kiriath Jearim, where the Ark of the Covenant had rested for 20 years, since its return from Philistine captivity, preparations began to bring God's presence to Jerusalem with appropriate ceremony. It all fell apart the first time, a painful lesson that God's holiness demands deep respect. When the oxen pulling the new cart stumbled, Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark and died instantly, struck down for touching what no human hands should handle. The sovereign's anger at this intervention gave way to fear that made him redirect the ark to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, where it remained for 3 months. But divine blessing upon Obed-Edom's household encouraged the king to complete the sacred mission with proper reverence. This time, Levites carried the ark on their shoulders, as Moses had commanded, while the ruler himself led the procession, wearing a linen ephod and dancing before the Lord with all his might. Every 6 steps, sacrifices were offered, as the golden box that symbolized heaven's presence made its way through Jerusalem's streets. The celebration that greeted the ark's arrival transformed the entire city into a sanctuary of praise. Musicians and singers, priests and people joined in worship that echoed from the walls, while the monarch distributed food to every person in Israel. But not all hearts rejoiced at the spectacle, for Michal, Saul's daughter and the royal wife, watched from her window with contempt for what she considered undignified behavior by a king. Her criticism when the sovereign returned to bless his household revealed the gulf between old royal attitudes and new covenant kingship. Michal scorned his dancing before slave girls, declaring it shameful for a monarch to expose himself like a common performer. But the ruler's response showed he understood that divine approval mattered more than human dignity. He would become even more undignified if it pleased the Lord who had chosen him over her father's house. That night, as celebration sounds faded and Jerusalem settled into sleep around the tent where God's presence now dwelt, the king's heart burned with a desire that would reshape the city's destiny. Sitting in his palace of cedar while the ark rested under tent curtains, the sovereign felt the disparity between his own comfort and the simple housing provided for heaven's throne on earth. Nathan the prophet, when consulted about the royal desire to build a temple, initially encouraged the project with human wisdom that seemed to support kingly piety. But that night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan with a message that would echo through generations yet unborn, establishing promises that earthly kingdoms could not contain. The divine response to the temple proposal carried both denial and confirmation that transformed disappointment into eternal hope. The Lord reminded Nathan that he had never requested a house of cedar during all his journeys with Israel from Egypt to the present day. The one who had taken the shepherd king from following sheep to become prince over the covenant people would indeed establish a house, but not a building made with human hands. Instead, the Lord would make the ruler a house in the truest sense, a dynasty that would endure beyond the lifespan of cedar and stone. The sovereign's son would build the temple in his father's place, while the royal throne would be established forever before the divine presence. This covenant exceeded even the promises made to Abraham, for it spoke not merely of numerous descendants, but of an eternal kingdom ruled by heaven's chosen line. In response, the monarch offered a prayer full of gratitude and humility, confessing human frailty and honoring divine loyalty. Sitting before the ark in the tent he had erected, The ruler marveled that God should make such promises to his servant's house. The covenant exceeded anything eye had seen or ear heard, establishing the royal lineage as the conduit through which divine purposes would flow to all nations. What came next on the battlefield proved that the king, who had been given such promises, had heaven on his side. Royal forces swept across the ancient Near East like fire consuming dry grass, subduing enemies who had threatened Israel for generations. The Philistines fell under tribute, their coastal cities acknowledging Hebrew supremacy that reversed centuries of intimidation. Moab felt the weight of royal justice as 2/3 of their warriors died for past aggression against Israel, while the survivors became servants paying tribute to Jerusalem's throne. Hadadezer, king of Zobah, found his forces scattered when he attempted to restore his dominion along the Euphrates, his 1,000 chariots and 7,000 horsemen falling to Hebrew bronze, while the sovereign hamstrung all but 100 of the captured horses. When Damascus sent forces to aid Zobah, they too fell before the advancing army, their city becoming another tributary, paying silver and gold to Jerusalem's treasury. Toi, king of Hamath, recognizing the shift in regional power, sent his son Joram with gifts of precious metals that acknowledged royal supremacy without requiring military conquest. These victories brought wealth beyond previous Hebrew imagination, flowing into Jerusalem's treasuries. Bronze and silver, gold and iron accumulated in storehouses, while the monarch dedicated all spoils to the Lord's service. The kingdom that had begun with a shepherd's sling now commanded tribute from nations that stretched from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. Still, the sovereign's greatest diplomatic triumph came through different means when he showed kindness to Mephibosheth, Jonathan's surviving son who had been crippled in childhood flight from Saul's falling dynasty. This act of covenant faithfulness, honoring his oath to Jonathan, demonstrated that royal power served loyalty rather than mere political advantage. But even the one appointed from above was not immune to the flaws of flesh, able to twist sacred favor into personal ruin. The incident began innocently enough when the king, walking on his palace roof during the spring season, when monarchs normally went to war, saw a woman bathing in the evening light. Bathsheba, wife of Uriah the Hittite, possessed beauty that caught the royal eye like sunlight on still water. What followed revealed how quickly power could corrupt judgment when desire overcame wisdom. The sovereign sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to the palace, where royal privilege overwhelmed moral restraint. The adultery that followed carried consequences that would haunt the kingdom for generations, setting patterns of family dysfunction that would tear the dynasty apart from within. When Bathsheba sent word that she had conceived, the king's attempts to cover his sin only deepened his guilt. Uriah's recall from the siege of Rabbah was meant to provide opportunity for the husband to lie with his wife, creating plausible paternity for the royal bastard. But Uriah's integrity exceeded the monarch's calculation. The loyal soldier refused to enjoy his home's comforts, while his comrades endured battlefield hardships. Desperate measures followed as the ruler made Uriah drunk, hoping wine would overcome the warrior's scruples. But even intoxicated, Uriah slept with his master's servants rather than visit his own house. His faithfulness a rebuke to royal faithlessness that made concealment impossible. The letter that Uriah carried back to Joab sealed his own death warrant with words that transformed the sovereign from shepherd king into calculating murderer. Instructions to place Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, then withdraw support so that he would die, turned military strategy into assassination while making the victim complicit in his own destruction. When Uriah died at the walls of Rabbah, along with other brave men sacrificed to cover royal guilt. The king's marriage to Bathsheba gave the illusion of closure. But the deed angered the Lord, and the justice of heaven was already setting events in motion to turn private sin into public reckoning. Nathan the prophet, who had once brought the ruler promises of eternal dynasty, now came with a parable that trapped the sovereign in his own judgment. The story of the rich man who stole the poor man's beloved lamb stirred royal anger against injustice, leading the monarch to pronounce death upon the oppressor who showed no pity. The prophet's response fell like a sword stroke across royal presumption, as Nathan declared that the king himself was the man who had stolen another's wife and arranged her husband's murder. Justice from above would follow the path the king himself had carved. His house would be marked by bloodshed, and his wives would be claimed by another before all to see, a humiliation deeper than the sin he tried to conceal. Though the monarch's immediate repentance saved him from death, it could not shield him from the judgment that followed. The child born of his sin would not survive, despite his anguished prayers, and in time, the seeds he had sown would bear bitter fruit as his sons tore the kingdom apart. Even as judgment lingered, mercy found a way. Bathsheba gave birth to Solomon, whose peaceful name bore the mark of heaven's grace and the call to rule. He grew in the palace, the product of love that had once come at a terrible price, destined to carry both the weight of promise and the memory of sin. As the reign moved toward its sunset years, the military campaigns that had established Israel's empire gave way to administrative challenges that required different skills. The ruler who had united the tribes through conquest now faced the task of governing a diverse population that included former enemies alongside covenant people. In his later years, the king demanded a census that exposed both the might of his realm and the arrogance that would invite judgment. Despite Joab's objections and the resistance of other leaders, he insisted on numbering Israel and Judah, showing faith in military strength over the unseen hand that had guided them. When the plague that followed this sin swept through Israel like wildfire, killing 70,000 men in 3 days, the monarch's anguish at seeing innocent people suffer for his transgression led to the purchase of Araunah's threshing floor. Here, where the angel's sword was halted by mercy from above, the king built an altar and offered sacrifices to stop the plague, consecrating the ground where his son would one day raise the temple. It was no accident that the threshing floor lay atop Mount Moriah, where Abraham once stood, knife in hand, ready to give up his son, until a ram appeared in the thicket, turning sorrow into mercy. This same mountain, marked by faith and surrender, would now hold the presence of God, not in a temple of man's making, but in one shaped by a higher blueprint. As the sovereign's strength waned and succession questions stirred palace intrigue, Adonijah IV's son attempted to claim the throne through political maneuvering that gathered support from Joab and Abiathar the priest. But Nathan and Bathsheba reminded the aging monarch of his oath to make Solomon his heir, leading to the younger prince's anointing at Gihon's spring, while his rival's celebration dissolved into fear. The ruler's final charge to Solomon carried both practical wisdom and spiritual insight that would guide the young king through challenges ahead. As his years waned, the sovereign pressed the importance of keeping the Lord's statutes and walking the path laid out by heaven, assuring that loyalty would preserve the dynasty. But he also provided detailed instructions for temple construction and arrangements for Levitical service that would transform Solomon's reign into the golden age of covenant worship. When the monarch died after 40 years of rule, 7 in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem, he left his son more than a unified kingdom and accumulated wealth. Raised from the flock, the Shepherd King forged a vision of rule where sacred purpose met human accountability, building structures that would endure beyond his life and rest. With him in the city he made holy. Solomon's accession to the throne marked the beginning of Israel's most prosperous era, when the promises made to Abraham about his descendants becoming a great nation would find their earthly fulfillment. The wisdom that the new ruler would request at Gibeon, the temple he would build according to his father's plans, and the glory that would make his reign legendary among nations lay ahead, like sunrise after a long night of preparation. When Solomon died after 40 years of unprecedented prosperity, the kingdom he left behind gleamed like gold, but groaned beneath burdens that royal wisdom had imposed upon unwilling shoulders. The magnificent temple crowned Jerusalem's heights with cedar and bronze, while trade routes brought exotic wealth from distant lands. Yet beneath this golden surface, resentment simmered like fire beneath ashes, waiting for the spark that would ignite civil war. Rehoboam, Solomon's chosen heir, journeyed north to Shechem, where the tribal representatives had gathered to confirm his succession. This ancient site, where Abraham had first received divine promises and where Joshua had renewed the covenant, now witnessed negotiations that would determine whether the united monarchy would endure or fragment into competing kingdoms. The delegation that met the new ruler came prepared with grievances accumulated through Solomon's reign. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had fled to Egypt after leading earlier resistance against royal policies, now returned to voice the northern tribes' demands. His words carried the weight of popular discontent that wise leadership might have addressed through compromise and reform. While recognizing Solomon's greatness, the petitioners also drew attention to the heavy toll his achievements had taken. The forced labor that had built the temple and royal palaces, the heavy taxation that had funded international trade and diplomatic marriages, the administrative districts that had broken traditional tribal boundaries. All these innovations had created prosperity at the expense of ancient freedoms that the covenant people cherished. Their request struck at the heart of royal governance as they asked Rehoboam to lighten the heavy yoke his father had placed upon them. If the new monarch would reduce their service obligations and ease the burden of taxation, they would serve him loyally as their ancestors had served his grandfather. The offer represented a reasonable compromise that acknowledged both royal authority and popular rights. But Rehoboam's response revealed how completely royal privilege had corrupted wisdom among those born to power. When he requested 3 days to consider their petition, the delay suggested either careful deliberation or dangerous overconfidence in his ability to dictate terms to subjects who had already demonstrated their willingness to resist. The council that followed exposed the generational divide between those who had earned their positions through service and those who had inherited authority without understanding its responsibilities. The old men who had served Solomon during his rise to power understood the delicate balance between royal prerogative and popular consent that effective governance required. Their advice reflected decades of experience in managing the tensions that arise when traditional societies encounter rapid change. They counseled the young ruler to grant the people's request, speaking good words that would win their hearts and secure their permanent loyalty. A monarch who served his people's legitimate interests would find them eager to serve his rightful authority in return. But the young men who had grown up with Rehoboam in palace luxury offered different counsel that revealed their ignorance of political reality beyond royal courts. These advisors, who had never known, want, or felt the weight of forced labor, urged the heir to demonstrate his superiority over his father through even harsher policies that would crush any hint of resistance. Their words dripped with contempt for common people, whom they regarded as mere resources to be exploited, rather than citizens whose consent legitimized royal rule. They advised Rehoboam to tell the petitioners that his little finger was thicker than his father's waist, that where Solomon had chastised them with whips, his son would chastise them with scorpions. The metaphor revealed more than its speakers intended, portraying royal authority as an instrument of punishment rather than protection, reducing governance to a contest of wills between ruler and ruled. Such attitudes might prevail temporarily through superior force, but they inevitably breed the resentment that destroys kingdoms from within. When the 3 days ended and the tribal representatives returned for the royal response, Rehoboam's choice between wise and foolish counsel would reshape the map of the ancient Near East. The young sovereign's words, when they came, demonstrated how privilege could blind even intelligent men to the consequences of their actions. Speaking with the arrogance of youth, convinced of its own invincibility, the heir declared that he would indeed make their yoke heavier than his father's burden. Where Solomon had disciplined them with whips, his son would use scorpions to enforce obedience. The response revealed complete ignorance of the political forces that had brought the delegation to Shechem in the first place. The reaction came swift and decisive as 10 tribes renounced their allegiance to the house of the shepherd king, with words that echoed earlier rebellions against royal authority. They proclaimed their independence with a slogan that had rallied resistance movements before. They had no portion in the son of Jesse, no inheritance in his descendants. Let every man return to his tents, while the rejected dynasty looked after its own house. From that moment on, the covenant people were split into 2 kingdoms, and the unity they once knew never returned. The northern 10 tribes chose Jeroboam as their ruler, establishing a separate monarchy that controlled the larger portion of Solomon's former territory. Only Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, creating a southern kingdom centered on Jerusalem and its temple. This division went beyond political conflict. It exposed clashing visions for the future of the covenant community. The North embraced a more traditional model that emphasized tribal autonomy and popular participation in governance, while the South maintained the Davidic monarchy with its emphasis on centralized authority and dynastic succession. Rehoboam's attempt to reassert control through military force ended in humiliation when the northern tribes stoned Adoram, the official responsible for forced labor, and forced the southern ruler to flee Jerusalem in his chariot. The symbolic rejection of royal oppression through this act of violence demonstrated how completely the heir had miscalculated the depth of popular resistance to Solomonic policies. Divine intervention prevented the civil war that might have destroyed both kingdoms before they could establish themselves as viable states. Through Shemaiah, the prophet, the Almighty commanded Rehoboam and his followers not to fight against their kinsmen, for the division itself had been ordained by heaven as judgment upon Solomon's apostasy. Right away, the northern kingdom was hit with challenges that shook its ability to stand on its own. Jeroboam's subjects looked naturally toward Jerusalem for religious guidance, since the temple and its priesthood remained in southern territory. The annual festivals that drew pilgrims from throughout the former United Kingdom now posed political threats to northern independence. The new ruler recognized that religious loyalty could easily translate into political allegiance, undermining his authority if his people continued worshipping at Solomon's temple. His solution revealed both political shrewdness and spiritual blindness, as he created alternative worship centers that would keep his subjects' devotion focused within his own borders. At Dan in the far north and Bethel near the southern border, Jeroboam erected golden calves that he proclaimed as the gods who had brought the people up from Egyptian bondage. The choice of symbols carried historical resonance, for these were the same images that had once tempted the covenant people during their wilderness wanderings. But the northern ruler calculated that familiar religious forms would ease the transition from temple worship to his new system. Jeroboam's innovation cut deeper than ceremony. He handed priestly duties to non-Levites, a clear departure from Moses' command to preserve that role for Levitical families. He also established new festivals to compete with Jerusalem's celebrations, creating a complete religious system that would serve his political purposes while maintaining the appearance of covenant faithfulness. Still, these changes struck at the heart of the religious unity that had held the covenant community together since Moses received the law at Sinai. The Northern Kingdom's religious innovations represented the first systematic attempt to adapt divine worship to human political convenience, setting precedents that would eventually corrupt both kingdoms' spiritual foundations. The Southern Kingdom, while maintaining control of the temple and its priesthood, faced its own challenges as it adapted to governing a much smaller territory with reduced resources. Rehoboam's realm now stretched from the border with the Northern Kingdom down to the traditional boundary with Egypt, encompassing the tribal territories of Judah and Benjamin, along with portions of Simeon in the far south. Losing northern tribute and trade routes forced the monarchy to rethink policies that once relied on ruling all of Solomon's empire. The wealth that had funded the previous reign's building projects and international diplomacy now evaporated, requiring more modest approaches to governance that earlier generations might have recognized as more sustainable. Despite everything, the Southern Kingdom preserved important assets that would be essential for its lasting survival. Jerusalem's prestige as the city where heaven had chosen to place its name attracted pilgrims and tribute from throughout the region, while the temple's priesthood provided continuity with ancient traditions that northern innovations could not replicate. The Davidic dynasty also carried legitimacy that Jeroboam's northern monarchy lacked, for the covenant promises made to the shepherd king continued to resonate among those who remembered prophecies of eternal rule. Though the kingdom had been divided, the royal line that heaven had established still occupied the throne where the Ark of the Covenant rested. Both kingdoms faced external threats that their division made more dangerous than they would have been for a united monarchy. Egypt, which had provided refuge for Jeroboam during his exile, now saw opportunity in Hebrew weakness to reclaim influence over territories that had once acknowledged Pharaoh's supremacy. In Rehoboam's 5th year, Shishak, king of Egypt, marched north with a massive army that included Libyans and Nubians, along with Egyptian forces. This invasion represented the first serious external threat the divided kingdoms had faced, testing whether their separate armies could defend territories that Solomon's united forces had easily controlled. As Egypt's forces surged forward, it was Judah that bore the heaviest blow. Fortified cities fell, and even Jerusalem stood under threat. The crisis forced Rehoboam to strip the temple and royal palace of their golden treasures, using Solomon's accumulated wealth to purchase withdrawal of forces that might otherwise have destroyed his capital. The humiliation went beyond mere financial loss as the southern ruler replaced the golden shields that had symbolized his father's glory with bronze substitutes that proclaimed to all observers how far royal fortunes had declined. The substitutions served as a constant reminder that the kingdom's golden age had ended with consequences that would be felt for generations. While Egypt didn't strike the northern kingdom directly, the foreign support that made it possible soon became a source of compromise. Jeroboam's debt to Pharaoh for sanctuary during his exile created obligations that limited his freedom to pursue policies that might conflict with Egyptian interests in the region. As years passed, the division that had begun as a political disagreement hardened into permanent hostility between kingdoms that shared common ancestry. but competing claims to represent the true Covenant community. Border warfare became endemic as each realm sought to expand its territory at the other's expense, while both competed for the loyalty of tribes and cities that might shift allegiance based on immediate advantages. The religious consequences of division proved even more devastating than the political effects, as competing claims to authentic worship created confusion among people who had once shared common festivals and traditions. The Northern Kingdom's innovations, while serving immediate political needs, opened doors to syncretism and apostasy that would eventually corrupt both realms' spiritual foundations. Prophetic voices arose to condemn the division and its consequences, warning that the Covenant people's strength had always depended upon their unity under divine authority. But these warnings went largely unheeded, as political necessity and royal pride prevented the reconciliation that might have restored the kingdom David had built and Solomon had adorned. Generation after generation followed the same divided path, with 19 northern and 20 southern monarchs presiding over kingdoms increasingly estranged from their united origins. Neither realm would ever again achieve the prosperity and security that the united monarchy had enjoyed at its height. Even so, divine purposes continued working through human failure, as the divided kingdoms preserved different aspects of the Covenant heritage that might otherwise have been lost. The North maintained stronger connections to tribal traditions and popular participation in governance, while the South preserved the temple worship and Davidic lineage through which ultimate restoration would eventually come. The tragedy of division thus contained seeds of hope for those who remembered that the same divine power which had brought judgment could also bring healing to a people willing to acknowledge their failures and return to the paths their ancestors had walked. But such restoration lay far in the future, beyond years of conflict and apostasy that would test whether covenant promises could survive the consequences of human pride and political ambition. Out of the covenant, people's divided lands came 200 years of downfall, unfolding like scrolls stained with grief and blood. The Northern Realm, calling itself by the ancient name that recalled Jacob's wrestling with heaven, pursued policies that led inexorably toward destruction. The Southern Territory, clinging to the Davidic dynasty and Jerusalem's temple, followed a more erratic path that alternated between reform and apostasy, like a drunkard stumbling toward an abyss. In Samaria, the northern capital that Omri had built upon a hill purchased for 2 talents of silver, a succession of rulers demonstrated the instability that plagued kingdoms founded upon rebellion rather than divine appointment. Coups and assassinations marked royal transitions as competing factions seized power through violence, creating a pattern of political chaos that weakened the realm's ability to resist external threats. The religious innovations that Jeroboam had introduced to prevent his subjects from returning to Jerusalem's temple gradually evolved into something far more dangerous than mere political expedience. What began as alternative worship centers at Dan and Bethel became gateways through which foreign influences corrupted the ancient faith that had sustained the covenant people since Moses received the law at Sinai. Ahab's son of Omri epitomized the northern kingdom's spiritual decline when he married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. This political alliance, designed to strengthen ties with Phoenician trading networks, brought Baal worship into the heart of the covenant community with a systematic thoroughness that earlier syncretism had never achieved. The queen, who had grown up worshipping storm gods and fertility deities, could not comprehend the exclusive claims that the God of Abraham made upon his chosen people. Her efforts to establish Baal temples throughout the northern realm, supported by hundreds of prophets who proclaimed foreign doctrines, represented the most serious threat to covenant faith since the golden calf incident in the wilderness. Into this crisis stepped Elijah the Tishbite, whose very name proclaimed that the Lord remained God despite royal apostasy. This prophet from Gilead's rugged highlands appeared in Ahab's court like lightning from a clear sky, announcing drought that would demonstrate heaven's power over the rain-bringing deities that Jezebel served. For 3 years, the heavens remained sealed, while crops withered and streams dried up across the northern territory. The contest that followed on Mount Carmel between Elijah and Baal's prophets became a defining moment when divine fire consumed water-soaked sacrifice, while foreign gods remained silent before their desperate servants' pleas. Even dramatic demonstrations of heavenly power could not permanently reverse the northern kingdom's spiritual trajectory. Jezebel's threats drove Elijah into exile, while succeeding rulers continued policies that gradually prepared their realm for the judgment that prophetic voices repeatedly warned was approaching. Like storm clouds gathering on distant horizons, Elisha, who received Elijah's mantle when his master was taken up in a whirlwind, continued the prophetic ministry that sought to recall the northern tribes to their covenant obligations. His miracles demonstrated divine compassion, even as his words proclaimed coming judgment upon rulers who persisted in policies that violated the ancient laws Moses had delivered. But prophetic intervention could only delay the consequences of systematic apostasy that had corrupted every level of northern society. When Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi, received divine commission to destroy Ahab's house, his zealous purge eliminated Baal worship while establishing new patterns of partial obedience that fell short of complete reformation. The revolution that brought Jehu to power demonstrated both the possibility of change and the limitations of reform movements that addressed symptoms while leaving deeper problems unresolved. The new dynasty abandoned Baal worship but maintained the golden calves at Dan and Bethel, creating a religious system that mixed covenant elements with innovations that gradually weakened the northern realm's spiritual foundations. As the northern territory's internal stability deteriorated, external pressures mounted like weights added to scales already approaching their breaking point. Assyrian expansion from Mesopotamian heartlands brought a military machine that had never known defeat into contact with Hebrew kingdoms, whose divisions made unified resistance impossible. Shalmaneser III first demanded tribute from Ahab, demonstrating Assyrian power while allowing local rulers to maintain nominal independence as long as they acknowledged imperial supremacy. This arrangement worked temporarily, but rising tribute demands and Assyrian interference in local politics gradually reduced the northern kingdom to a puppet state whose survival depended upon imperial tolerance. Tiglath-Pileser III, who reorganized Assyrian administration with ruthless efficiency, began the systematic dismantling of the northern realm that would culminate in total destruction. His campaigns stripped away northern territories piece by piece, deporting populations and replacing them with foreign settlers in a deliberate policy designed to prevent future rebellions. The final act began when Hoshea, the northern kingdom's last ruler, attempted to throw off Assyrian domination by seeking Egyptian support against his imperial overlords. This desperate gamble, born of desperation rather than strategic wisdom, provided Shalmaneser V with the excuse he needed to complete the destruction his predecessors had begun. Over the course of 3 years, Assyria's siege works wrapped around Samaria, gradually cutting off its lifelines and leaving the city too weak to resist. Within the walls, defenders consumed everything edible while hoping for relief that would never come. When Sargon II completed the conquest that his predecessor had begun, the northern kingdom simply ceased to exist as a political entity. The deportation that followed represented more than military conquest. It constituted an attempt to erase the northern tribe's identity so completely that they could never again threaten Assyrian security. 27,000 captives were forcibly relocated to distant provinces, where they would be absorbed into local populations and lose their distinctive covenant heritage. To the surprise of even the Assyrians, the plan succeeded. Over time, the 10 northern tribes faded from the record, remembered only as the mysterious lost tribes. Their destruction served as a warning to the southern territory that covenant violations carried consequences no political maneuvering could avoid indefinitely. In Jerusalem, news of Samaria's fall struck like lightning, illuminating the darkness that royal policies had created around the remaining kingdom. Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, who ruled Judah during this crisis, understood that survival required both spiritual reformation and political wisdom that could navigate the treacherous currents of imperial politics. The religious revival that Hezekiah initiated went far beyond the superficial changes that had characterized earlier reform movements. His workers systematically destroyed high places and sacred pillars, Asherah poles and bronze serpents that had become objects of idolatrous worship. Even the bronze serpent that Moses had made in the wilderness was broken in pieces when people began offering incense to it. More significantly, the southern ruler reopened the temple that his father Ahaz had defiled and restored the priesthood to its proper functions. The Passover celebration that followed drew pilgrims from throughout the region, including survivors from the northern territories, who recognized Jerusalem's temple as their only remaining link to covenant traditions. This religious reformation was accompanied by administrative and military reforms that prepared the southern territory for the Assyrian assault that everyone knew was coming. Hezekiah's engineers constructed the tunnel that brought water from the Gihon spring into Jerusalem's walls, ensuring the capital's ability to withstand siege. Archaeological evidence of this remarkable engineering achievement still bears testimony to the determination with which the southern kingdom prepared for its trial. When Sennacherib, king of Assyria, finally turned his attention to Judah after consolidating control over the northern territories, his invasion swept through the countryside like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. 46 fortified cities fell to Assyrian siege engines, while their populations were carried away into captivity that promised to duplicate the northern kingdom's fate. The siege of Jerusalem that followed tested every aspect of Hezekiah's preparations, as Assyrian forces surrounded the city with earthworks and siege engines that had never failed to reduce enemy strongholds. Within the walls, defenders watched their food supplies dwindle, while enemy heralds proclaimed the futility of resistance against imperial might. Sennacherib's psychological warfare included messages designed to undermine Jewish morale by reminding them how easily other gods had fallen before Assyrian power. The Rabshakeh's speeches, delivered in Hebrew so that common people on the walls could understand, painted vivid pictures of the fate awaiting those who trusted in divine protection against imperial reality. But the God of Abraham had not abandoned his covenant people despite their failures, and the deliverance that came demonstrated divine power, working through means that no human strategy could have devised. In a single night, the angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, forcing Sennacherib to withdraw to Nineveh, where he was later assassinated by his own sons. This miraculous deliverance extended the southern kingdom's existence for more than a century, providing time for spiritual and political developments that would shape the covenant community's future in ways no contemporary observer could have anticipated. Yet the reprieve also created dangerous complacency among those who interpreted survival as divine approval of their current condition rather than gracious opportunity for repentance. Manasseh, Hezekiah's son, ruled longer than any other Judean monarch while systematically undoing his father's reforms and leading the southern territory deeper into apostasy than it had ever known. His 55-year reign brought Assyrian religious practices into the temple itself, defiling the holy place with altars to foreign gods, and even sacrificing his own son in the fire. Instead of learning from the fall of the north, the king repeated the same mistakes that had drawn judgment on Samaria. His persecution of faithful prophets and righteous citizens filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, while his syncretistic religious policies corrupted the covenant faith that had sustained the community through previous crises. Even in the depths of this bleak era, a door remained open. Manasseh's downfall under Assyrian rule led him into exile, where hardship taught him lessons that peace had not. His eventual reforms, though too late to undo the damage, proved that mercy could still reach the most unlikely of hearts. Josiah, Manasseh's grandson, initiated the most thorough religious reformation in Judean history when workmen discovered the Book of the Law during temple repairs. The reading of this ancient document revealed how far the covenant community had strayed from divine standards, prompting the young ruler to implement changes that touched every aspect of religious and social life. Josiah's reforms reached their peak in a Passover unlike any since Solomon, a moment of worship restored to its roots. The celebration showed what the people could be when their practices were shaped by the ancient commandments, free from outside influence or personal creativity. But even Josiah's commendable efforts could not reverse consequences that generations of apostasy had set in motion. His death at Megiddo, while attempting to prevent Pharaoh Necho from supporting Assyrian resistance to rising Babylonian power, marked the beginning of the end for the southern kingdom's independence. The geopolitical situation that emerged from Assyrian collapse created new dangers that the divided loyalties and weakened institutions of Josiah's successors could not effectively address. Babylonian expansion under Nebuchadnezzar brought a new imperial power into contact with the southern territory, at precisely the moment when internal divisions made unified resistance impossible. Jehoiakim's rebellion against Babylonian overlordship, encouraged by Egyptian promises of support that proved worthless when tested, provided Nebuchadnezzar with the justification he needed to begin the systematic destruction of the southern kingdom. The siege and capture of Jerusalem in 597 BC marked the beginning of the end, as the first deportation carried away the skilled craftsmen and political leaders whose expertise was essential for effective governance. Zedekiah, the last ruler of the southern territory, inherited an impossible situation that required wisdom and faithfulness he did not possess. His vacillating policies and ultimate rebellion against Babylonian authority completed the destruction that earlier mistakes had initiated, leading to the final siege that ended with Jerusalem's walls broken down and the temple itself reduced to smoking ruins. The deportation of 586 BC marked the total collapse of the southern kingdom as a political power. Those left behind in the ruined land struggled to survive, grieving not only their shattered world, but also the seeming breakdown of the promises that had carried their forebears through earlier trials. Even in the shadow of exile, prophetic voices declared that the story was far from over. This was the valley before the rising of a greater hope. Jeremiah in the ruined city, Ezekiel beside the river, Daniel in the halls of empire, and others known only to their companions, all clung to the belief that the one who had made the covenant would remain true, even when the people did not. The books of Lamentations and certain Psalms captured the immediate emotional impact of destruction, while laying foundations for theological reflection that would sustain the covenant community through centuries of foreign domination. Their struggles with the justice of their maker and the trustworthiness of the Old Covenant would leave a lasting imprint, shaping faith long after the nation rose again from its broken foundations. In Babylon's ziggurat-crowned capital, where the Euphrates flowed past gardens that rivaled paradise, and where the covenant people had learned to sing the Lord's songs in a foreign land, news arrived that would reshape the ancient world. Cyrus the Great, monarch of the Medes and Persians, had conquered the seemingly invincible empire that had destroyed Jerusalem and carried Judah's finest into captivity. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BC came not through prolonged siege, but through strategic brilliance that diverted the Euphrates and allowed Cyrus's forces to enter the city beneath its walls. The empire that had seemed eternal crumbled in a single night, its gods proving powerless to protect the realm that had trusted in bronze idols and military might rather than divine favor. Unlike previous conquerors who had built their empires through terror and cultural destruction, Cyrus the Persian practiced policies of tolerance that recognized the administrative value of allowing subject peoples to maintain their religious traditions and local customs. This enlightened approach to imperial governance would create opportunities for restoration that no Hebrew prophet had dared to imagine during the darkest years of exile. The edict that emerged from the Persian court in 538 BC carried implications that extended far beyond administrative convenience. Cyrus proclaimed that the Lord God of heaven had given him all the kingdoms of the earth and had charged him to build a house in Jerusalem. All covenant people among his subjects could return to their ancestral homeland, taking with them the temple vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away as spoils of conquest. This proclamation fulfilled prophecies that Isaiah had spoken 2 centuries earlier, naming Cyrus as the Lord's anointed shepherd who would accomplish divine purposes despite his ignorance of the God who had raised him to supremacy. That a pagan monarch played a key role in the restoration revealed that the power behind the story wasn't limited to Israel's own kings, but could work through any throne. The response to this opportunity revealed how profoundly exile had changed the covenant community's character and aspirations. Of the hundreds of thousands who had been carried away or born in captivity, only a remnant chose to abandon the security they had built in Mesopotamia for the uncertainties of rebuilding devastated territories. Zerubbabel, grandson of King Jehoiakim, who had been carried into captivity with the first deportation, emerged as the natural leader for those who chose return over comfortable assimilation. His royal blood linked the restoration community to the Davidic dynasty, while his Persian appointment as governor provided the political authority necessary for effective administration. Beside Zerubbabel stood Jeshua, the high priest, descendant of the family that had served in Solomon's temple before its destruction. Together, these leaders represented the dual authority, civil and religious, that would guide the returned exiles through the challenges of rebuilding their shattered community on ancient foundations. The first group of returning exiles numbered 42,360, along with their servants and their livestock, creating a migration that rivaled the original exodus from Egyptian bondage. They carried with them not only personal possessions, but also the temple treasures that Cyrus had restored, golden and silver vessels that would once again serve in worship at the place where heaven had chosen to dwell among his people. Nearly 15 centuries after Abraham went the other way, the community retraced his path back to Jerusalem, weaving their new beginning into the fabric of their earliest history. But where the patriarch had left civilization for unknown territories, these exiles left established lives for the task of rebuilding what their fathers' sins had brought to ruin. After 70 years, the land remained scarred. Jerusalem's walls were still shattered, and the Temple Mount sat desolate, untouched by song, since the day Babylon set it ablaze. Wild beasts denned in palaces where kings had once held court, while thorns and thistles covered fields that had once produced grain for royal tables. Their top priority upon returning made clear that they understood where covenant renewal had to begin. Before rebuilding homes or replanting vineyards, they erected an altar on the Temple Mount and resumed the daily sacrifices that connected earth to heaven through smoke and flame. The burnt offerings that ascended from this makeshift altar proclaimed that the covenant people had returned not merely to reclaim territory, but to restore their relationship with the God who had chastened them through exile. The foundation-laying ceremony for the Second Temple created a mixture of joy and sorrow that captured the complex emotions surrounding this restoration. Those young enough to have no memory of Solomon's magnificent sanctuary rejoiced at the beginning of reconstruction, while those old enough to remember the first temple's glory wept at the modest scale of what was being rebuilt. What they saw wasn't just about missing gold or grandeur. It pointed to something far beyond architecture. The returned community lacked the wealth that had funded Solomon's building projects, the political independence that had allowed earlier kings to conscript labor from throughout their territories, and the international alliances that had provided materials from distant lands. But opposition arose that threatened to prevent completion of even this modest reconstruction. The mixed population that had remained in the land during the exile, augmented by foreign settlers whom Assyrian and Babylonian policies had introduced, claimed the right to participate in rebuilding the temple as fellow worshippers of the God of heaven. These Samaritans, as they came to be called from their center at the ancient northern capital, represented the complex ethnic and religious situation that exile had created. Their ancestors included both Israelites who had escaped deportation and foreign colonists who had adopted local religious practices, creating a syncretic community that blended covenant elements with pagan traditions. Zerubbabel and Jeshua's rejection of Samaritan participation in temple reconstruction reflected theological concerns about religious purity that exile had intensified among the covenant community. The returned exiles had learned through bitter experience that compromise with foreign religious practices led inevitably to the apostasy that had brought divine judgment upon their fathers. But this decision created lasting enmity between the restoration community and their neighbors, who responded to exclusion by actively opposing the building project through political interference and economic pressure. Their complaints to Persian authorities portrayed the returned exiles as potential rebels whose temple would become a center for anti-imperial activities. The effectiveness of this opposition became apparent when work on the temple ceased for 16 years, from the second year of Cyrus until the second year of Darius. During this period, the restoration community focused on rebuilding their own houses, while the temple foundation remained exposed to weather and neglect that symbolized their spiritual priorities. Divine displeasure at this delay found expression through the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, whose messages challenged the community's excuses for postponing temple reconstruction. Haggai's pointed question cut to the heart of their misplaced priorities. Was it time for them to live in paneled houses while God's house lay in ruins? The economic difficulties that had supposedly prevented temple reconstruction were reinterpreted as divine judgment upon their selfishness. Their harvests had disappointed expectations, and their wages had seemed to disappear into bags with holes, because they had sought their own prosperity while neglecting the sanctuary that should have been their first concern. Zechariah's visions provided encouragement that balanced Haggai's reproofs, showing the restoration community that their modest efforts had cosmic significance that human eyes could not perceive. The temple they were building might appear insignificant compared to Solomon's magnificent structure, but it would serve divine purposes that would ultimately surpass anything the past had achieved. When construction resumed under this prophetic encouragement, Persian authorities initially questioned the project's legality until searches of imperial archives confirmed Cyrus's original authorization. Darius not only permitted continuation of the work, but ordered provincial governors to provide financial support from tax revenues, transforming opposition into assistance through divine providence working within imperial bureaucracy. The completed temple, dedicated in the 6th year of Darius's reign, lacked the gold and precious stones that had adorned its predecessor, but represented something more precious than material wealth. This sanctuary symbolized the community's renewed commitment to the covenant relationship that Exile had tested but not destroyed. Temple worship had been renewed, but that alone couldn't resolve the deeper tensions of preserving a distinct covenant identity in a threatening world. Intermarriage with neighboring peoples threatened to repeat the patterns of assimilation that had contributed to the original exile, while ignorance of divine law left many unable to distinguish between authentic covenant practices and foreign innovations. Into this crisis came Ezra the scribe, whose arrival from Babylon brought both legal expertise and imperial authority to address the community's spiritual needs. Backed by Artaxerxes, he took up the task of teaching those ready to listen, establishing justice not by the standards of distant nations, but by the foundational teachings of his own people. When Ezra read the law aloud to the gathered crowd, the people's emotional response made clear just how deeply the teachings of their ancestors had faded during the years of exile. When the community heard Moses' words read in Hebrew and explained in Aramaic so that all could understand, their weeping demonstrated both sorrow for past failures and joy at rediscovering their heritage. The reforms that followed addressed practical issues whose resolution was essential for the community's survival as a distinct people. The problem of mixed marriages required painful separations that broke up families, but preserved the covenant line from assimilation that had destroyed the northern tribes. These measures, though severe in appearance, echoed hard-won lessons from exile about the cost of straying from the ways they had been called to follow. Nehemiah's arrival from the Persian court brought additional resources and authority that enabled the community to address its physical vulnerability. The walls of Jerusalem had remained broken since Nebuchadnezzar's destruction, leaving the restoration community defenseless against enemies who regularly threatened their security. Rebuilding the city's defenses called for more than just engineering. It took diplomacy to outmaneuver the regional governors who viewed Jerusalem's rise as a challenge to their power. Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite, official, led a coalition that attempted to prevent wall building through ridicule, threats, and political interference. But Nehemiah's combination of practical organization and spiritual dependence created a response that frustrated every attempt at sabotage. The workers who rebuilt Jerusalem's defenses carried weapons alongside their tools, ready to fight for the city they were restoring, while trusting in divine protection that had sustained them through previous crises. Finished in a mere 52 days, despite constant resistance, the rebuilt walls testified to a power at work beyond human effort, one even their foes couldn't deny. The speed of construction and the project's success, despite overwhelming odds, proclaimed that heaven still watched over the restoration community with the same care that had preserved their ancestors through wilderness wanderings. The covenant renewal ceremony that followed wall completion brought together elements of religious reformation that had been developing since the first exiles returned to Jerusalem. Through the reading of the law collective repentance, and a formal vow to live by the teachings passed down from their ancestors, the community found footing it had lacked since the exile. This restoration represented more than political independence or religious observance. It constituted the transformation of the covenant people from a kingdom dependent upon human institutions into a community whose identity rested upon divine law and prophetic hope. The changes that exile had forced upon them prepared the way for survival through centuries of foreign domination that would test their faith in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. Guiding this pivotal shift, the men of the Great Assembly preserved both the writings held to be sacred and the interpretive wisdom needed to carry those teachings into an evolving world. Their work in collecting and organizing the scriptures created the foundation upon which later religious development would build. Their collective memory wasn't built on myth alone. It carried the weight of real traditions that had been faithfully passed down. The continuity between pre-exilic and post-exilic periods exceeded what skeptical scholarship had once considered possible. What they passed on wasn't just faith, but also fresh institutions and insights that would carry their descendants through the trials of the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Their experience of maintaining covenant identity without political independence created patterns that would sustain Jewish communities through centuries of dispersion. The messianic hopes that flourished during this period drew upon the Davidic promises that had sustained the royal dynasty through its rise and fall, but transformed them into expectations that transcended political restoration. The coming Anointed One would establish a kingdom that no earthly empire could destroy, fulfilling promises that human kings had been unable to achieve. Out of the exile rose a community that had learned to cherish the teachings of their tradition more than wealth, to pursue holiness over political ease, and to believe in a future restoration beyond anything their forebears had seen. Their suffering carved out a readiness for a mission that would reach past their borders to bless all peoples. The story that had begun with Abraham's journey from Ur toward an unknown land thus found its climax not in earthly kingdoms that rose and fell like waves upon the shore, but in the preservation of promises that would outlast empires and sustain hope through centuries when heaven seemed silent and heavenly purposes appeared to slumber.